Hello and welcome to Business on the Wire. I'm Nitali Mukherjee. If the last 2 years have been difficult for the Indian economy, the year 2022 seems to have thrown things into complete turmoil. There is a stock market that is unwinding hard as we speak. More importantly, the currency has lost immense ground. Inflation has now surged to multi year highs, and the general economic condition seems starker and more worrying than it was a couple of years back. What is the context in which we now rebuild or aim to look for solutions? Can we expect to have the same outcomes we did even 6 months back? And what is the role of Indian industry within that? What are the imperatives for the government, most importantly? Joining me to talk about that is a man who's been emblematic with a lot of these issues as we've discussed them over the last months. He is one of the leading faces and names in Indian industry. He's past president CII, and of course, he's most recently authored a book that's called The Struggle and the Promise. Joining me today to speak about much of this is Naushad Forbes. Thank you very much for joining in and speaking with me. And we didn't get to speak when your book launched, but congratulations on it.
Thank you.
I feel like from the time your book was released to now, there is almost an apocalyptic nature to how things have progressed from there on. Uh, how are you feeling first about the environment? Because really, we've had 2 difficult years now, but I don't think anything compares to what we were witnessing in the first half of 22.
So exactly. I think what you mentioned just now, start of this year, I think there was a lot of optimism because we said, hey, we see Omicron has come, but it's not as bad as everyone was fearing. We're finally able to get back to normal. And then we get hit with the consequences of the Russia-Ukraine. And really, more than the consequence to look at, so it's depressing, it's worrying without question. But I guess, as I'm about, okay, so if I was writing my book today, would I write it differently? Would I write, I would obviously, you need to refer to, epical events like the or the Russia-Ukraine war. But because the book is, it's about India, and it gets the message. I think the fundamental message is that India is a long-term play. It's not a short-term play, and that anyone who wants to succeed in India from outside needs to see India in those terms, as a long-term play, as a 30-year project in the making. And the greatness that we have to aspire for, it seems to me, has to be seen in those terms. And we will have noise along the way. We will have times in our history when we really are deeply concerned about the direction that we're moving in. But I think the fundamental trajectory is what matters. And is the fundamental trajectory pointing broadly in the right direction? And there's always so much noise in the system that I think one needs to constantly try to distinguish between noise and trends. Noises matter. Noise is best ignored, even if it can be very depressing in the short run.
Yeah. No, it's interesting you say that, and we will talk about that in more depth. Can you recall a time, though, in the past, Naushad, where we have lived through an environment like this? Because a lot of people now are talking about the 2008 crisis, for example, but I see it as different because over there it was a financial system that was rotten and spilling out into the broader economy, whereas here there has been serious pain in the broader economy for months now, which is perhaps now beginning to filter into or insidiously make its way into the financial markets as we see it barometers of what's happening with trade and sentiment. Have we seen anything like this before?
So we haven't seen the kind of potential for the world to get back into a serious international conflict in since the Second World War. I mean, um, it's I think to see that kind of fighting happening on the ground and that kind of damage being done to a country is terribly depressing. But I think that's what should concern us. I think in terms of the economic consequences, I think we'll have lots of short run hits, but we need to worry in India about our long term fundamentals. So we need to worry about investment in human capital. We need to worry about education systems. We need to worry about employment and employment creation. Those were what we needed to worry about 5 years ago. Those are what we needed to worry about 2 years ago in the middle of the pandemic. And those are what we need to worry about today, it seems to me. Those need to be our top priorities. I personally am not a great believer in the stock market telling us anything useful.
Right.
I've never been able to understand why it moves in what direction, certainly for specific companies. And I've never been, and this is not because it isn't important, it's just that I can't understand.
I did. I was struck by, and I'm reading from your book, where you say with a $5 trillion economy, we will be as rich in 2026 as Indonesia is today. But to be as rich as China is today, we must sustain
Yeah.
9% growth per year for 20 years. That surely must be our minimum aspiration, to be as rich in 20 years as China is today. I'm struck by the comment you made earlier about the fact that the larger trajectory remains the same, because for many economists, they feel like it isn't. They feel like the last 10 years have seen a serious rupture in what was the broader trajectory. How are you feeling about this growth target that you've set out? Because 20 years is a long time, and and that's really the country and market that we aspire to compete with, do we not?
Very, very much so. I am concerned about the immediate performance that we've had as an economy. And when I say immediate performance, I'm talking longer term, as you are, since 2012. So the last 10 years have been, our growth has suffered.
Yeah.
And I think it's suffered for various reasons. I think it's suffered because of external factors like the pandemic, like now the war in Europe. But it's also suffered because of things we've done wrong.
Yeah.
It's suffered because of fostering unnecessary uncertainty in the economy, such as demonetization, which I think was a huge blow, particularly in disrupting the certainty with which investment can take place. It was sort of a man-made massive economic disruptor.
I was going to say disaster, but we'll go with disruption.
Yeah. And it was and then we've had I think a move away from an open economy on the trade side, which I think is also a mistake. I'm seeing some encouraging signs now that we as a country seem to be wanting to engage more, sign more, get back to signing free trade agreements and so on, which I hope is a tangible indicator that we are becoming more open again. But I think the jury's still out. I hope it's at least it's more positive, and I hope we keep moving in that direction.
Are you hopeful of that, Naushad? Because it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Especially post-pandemic, it's almost like words like globalization and free trade are
Yeah.
bad words, for countries to be using. Increasingly, especially when you talk about the economic lens, it's looking inwards, it's nationalism. This whole "Make in India," for example, as well, seems to suggest "Make in India" equals anyone else is not welcome.
I mean, it's very much the case just now. So here's what my hope is. in the 60s and 70s, the world like South Korea and Taiwan took great advantage of that. In the 80s and 90s, the world was again increasingly open, and a country like China took in huge advantage of that.
Yeah.
In that entire period, until essentially 1990, we did not take advantage of that. We were contrary to the rest of the world. The rest of the world was opening more and more, and we were is questioning globalization, questioning free trade, questioning the merit of open markets. I hope we will be contrary and actually become a force for all of those things, a force for trade, a force for globalization, a force for globalization as a way of providing better livelihoods for people across all strata in society, in India and elsewhere. I think globalization and trade can be that force for good.
You talked about this in the past, and you have talked about it at length in your book, which is the big issue of jobs, Naushad. The fact that we need better quality, the fact that manufacturing itself has really remained at such a small percentage in terms of what it does for jobs overall. The only problem is that to address a problem, you have to first accept that there is a problem. And feedback so far has been that we don't have a jobs crisis. We don't have an unemployment problem. There's enough happening. People are self-made entrepreneurs. This will figure itself out.
That may be the public narrative that's put out there. But if you talk to senior policymakers, and I think they're conscious of a jobs crisis, they're conscious of employment being an issue. And I think the way it has to be framed is not as a short-term issue, not that, look, has employment got worse since the pandemic hit? Yes, it's got worse, in my view, since the pandemic hit. But we weren't in great shape before the pandemic either. And I think it's a longer term issue. We suffer from too few formal, high quality jobs in the country. And I think few people will question that, that few people will question the actual situation on the ground, that look, as a country, 85% of the employment we have is informal. And this informal employment comes with almost no protection. Yeah. So some of the moves we've seen recently of, on the labor reform side have been encouraging, but they need to go much further. Because we need to find ways in which we can provide that balance of flexibility and protection for all segments of labor, not just the 15% that's formally employed. Mm.
What is the role that you see industry playing in that case? I mean, has there not been enough of a thrust on manufacturing? Is it not important? What's happening at that end?
So, there are two parts to it. One is what we need to do in terms of wider labor markets. And second is what we need to do in terms of labor-intensive manufacturing. I think industry and maybe even manufacturing will do okay in the country. The big question is on labor-intensive manufacturing, where we have really struggled as a country for decades. Yeah. And we don't have to look very far for the right kinds of examples. Just look next door at Bangladesh and what they've done with their garment industry. A thriving industry that employs millions of people is something that we could easily have if we approach it with the same way of saying that, listen, we need a certain amount of protection. We need a lot of flexibility so that we can have labor-intensive manufacturing in certainly our poorer states. Why can't an Orissa or an Assam or a West Bengal have the same kind of thriving garment industry that Bangladesh has? There's no good reason why not. It's issues of policy that come in the way. So what we need to do on labor-intensive manufacturing is a very specific set of things, which will also involve changing mindsets in Indian industry. That labor-intensive manufacturing is attractive. Today, I think Indian industry has the strong perception that more labor is bad. We should minimize labor. We should automate as much as we can. All of those are these instincts that have been bred in us in industry over the last 50 years. Because of the policies that we've had, and that change in mindset needs to happen. It will take time to happen, and we will have to keep working at it. And maybe we need a few Foxcons and Lian Fungs being attracted to India to set up massive plants that will source their garments and their phones from India on whatever conditions, and then Indian entrepreneurs being attracted by those examples and saying we can make fortunes doing this as well, not just by building refineries and ports somewhere.
On that point, though, your book is also full of many R.K. Lakshman cartoons, and you write, saying the distrust between industry and government, which was so pervasive in the 70s and 80s, was something he caught perfectly. We unfortunately see that distrust returning today. Is it distrust, Naushad, or is it a lack of the ability to tell the government like it is? I mean, on the point that you're making about what industries need or a textile industry needs, our industry faces walking into a room and laying it out as it is and demanding from the government what is right and fair and good. Because again, over there, what it seems like is, a community that is rather pliable to the government and its very abrupt changes in policy decisions.
I don't think Indian industry has ever been particularly direct in its criticism. It is not with this government. Yeah. I'm not sure it was particularly with the previous government either. I think it reflects a mindset of the earlier license Raj, where we were constantly going to the government and asking for things because we had to get things done. You had to go and get licenses and so on to do everything.
Yeah.
And I think that mindset, even though the policies changed, where you didn't need to go to the government for things, the mindset has hardly changed. I think there's still this thing of asking the government for protection, asking the government for incentives, asking the government for things. That mindset has to change once and for all. Unfortunately, there's a lot of interest on both sides, on the side of industry to keep asking for protection and incentives, and on the side of the government to keep providing protection and incentives as a way of keeping industry, pliant. I think policy has to place the national interest ahead of this somewhat cozy relationship, and where we then, the sentence that I have in my book is that an industrialist criticizing the government should not make the headlines. That to me is the best metric of an independent private sector. So I'm not saying that industrialists their job is not to criticize the government, but if it's called for, they should. And if it is called for and they do criticize the government, it should be such a normal day-to-day thing that no one notices. It's just a part of how things happen in the country. Today, any industrialist criticizing the government, it's front page headlines, and there'll be a talk show on why they said what they did, and there'll be this big battle. And it should be ignored. It shouldn't become news.
Maybe
I'm okay. I don't. Look at your expressions. Your expression says, "Oh, I'm waiting for the day."
No. My expression says, "I wish it would happen."
I wish too. I think that's what we have to hope for. We have to really hope for the day when, it's not. I think the day. We should look for a day, not just when industry criticizes the government or whichever government is in power at the time, but we should look for a day when that doesn't make the news.
Yeah.
When that is not noteworthy.
Yeah. Let me shift to the here and now again for a bit. Your book, I think, sort of closed before this wave of inflation hit us.
Yeah.
So, a two-part question on that. One, how worried are you about the kind of inflation we're seeing? And two, some part of what insulated us over the last 2 years was the fact that the top end of industry, the listed companies or the top
Yeah.
50 or 100 companies actually managed to do quite well in a tough environment. But now you're beginning to see some pressure and pain there thanks to inflation. Are you worried about that segment? And how worried are you about inflation as a whole?
So there are two parts to the inflation that we're seeing. There's some part of it that's temporary.
Yeah.
It's affected by food prices, commodity prices, oil prices, etc. With a combination of the recovery in economic growth post the pandemic in the West, and also now more recently the stress from the war. So I think some of that is temporary and will wash out. My bigger concern is how will we deal with it? That do we have enough sort of monetary expertise to deal with in a balanced, rational way, where we say a certain amount of tightening may be needed at certain times to deal with, let's say more, let's say demand exceeding supply, and where you try to bring them back into match. But I'm not sure we're there yet. I think we still do not have serious supply side constraints. Supply side constraints are a reflection of matches where supply. That's where you should use my policy to actually correct things. I don't think we're there yet. So my concerns about inflation, will it show in the results of larger companies? Yes, it will. That doesn't bother me. Honestly, that doesn't bother me. I don't think any of these companies are going to go bankrupt as a result. They will show reduced profits. So the record profits that they showed last year will drop. That doesn't bother me.
Perhaps it will show up in other ways. And, you talk about this in your book. I spoke some months back with Professor Jaffrilo, who made the point that India as a country, many years back, perhaps chose to push hard on growth while ignoring development. You talk about that to an extent as well when you talk about what Duflo and Banerjee had to say, on growth and the fact that we didn't do it the right way. Jaffrilo's point was that now we have neither. Uh, how do you feel about a statement like that, with the added layer of this cost pressure that households are feeling, Naushad? They are feeling it, the lower middle income, the middle income.
So two-part answer. First, I don't agree with the comment.
Okay.
I don't agree that India stressed growth over development and distribution. If anything, in the 60s, I would say during Indira Gandhi, we used development as an excuse for not growing rapidly. So it was the opposite, if you ask me. And even in the 90s, as the reforms took place, and as the Manmohan Singh as finance minister, Manmohan Singh as finance minister, Narasimha Rao as prime minister, as all those reforms took place, the growth objectives that we had were very clearly tied to development. This was seen as a way of actually developing. And that's what we did. If you look at the performance of the last 30 years, it's not just the most rapid growth in our history. It's also the period in our history where we reduced the number of people, the proportion of the population, and the absolute number of people below the poverty line more than at any other time in our history. So the growth led to development, and we should not in any way qualify that understanding and appreciation. Now, that's the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer is, could we have done more on the development side? Could we have done more to be more inclusive in our growth achievements? And the answer is yes, we could have. And I think the answer lies in education and investment in especially schooling, good quality schooling, and then fixing our labor market so that people can get better quality jobs. That's the way to ensure that the fruits of growth flow through the economy to a much greater extent than they have. So while I will say and repeat that growth led to development, in any way dilute that. I hear economists talking about, there's a lot of do-gooder stuff around. And focus on growth such that we make that growth as inclusive as it possibly can be. So I really think it's a two-part answer.
Okay. If I were to ask you for a one-word answer on this one, because your book really does cover so much in terms of education, health, manufacturing, focused on job creation. If you were to advise the government and they would say, okay, the next 5 years, I'm going to pick just one thing, only one thing to focus on and do it really, really well with spend and planning, what would you pick from these three, from education or health or job creation, skilled job creation?
I would actually pick investment in schooling and primary education. And I know that's not a union government issue alone. It's a joint subject under our constitution, both union and states. But the union government can incentivize states and provide a lot of funding to states that do the right kinds of things to improve the quality of the public education system and quality in the private education system. Because today, half of all Indian children go to private schools. That proportion has fallen a bit during the pandemic because parents simply couldn't afford, in poorer parts of the country, simply couldn't afford to continue sending their children to private schools, but it's still close to half. And that's a huge number that we need to improve the quality of overall, both public and private education. So if I can do only one thing, that's the one thing that I would do. But I would closely follow it with the second thing, which is on labor reform.
Okay. One final question. You write towards the end in your book, saying bad is bad, and if we learn from the past to correct mistakes in the present, that's fine. But if we use the past to justify poor performance today, we are condemning ourselves to continued development. You've always spoken honestly about what you see as right and wrong, Naushad. And people like Kaushik Basu and people like Raghuram Rajan have talked about the economic cost we are paying for the social damage that we are seeing over the last many years. And much of it is, constantly harking back to the past. This one's fault, that one's fault, this party, that party. Does that work?
It does, because I think it's a focus on the wrong issues. Yeah. We should be focusing on the things that really unify us as a country. And our growth aspiration is something that can really unify us, and it can improve the prospects for all Indians of all communities, of all regions in the country. That's what we should be worrying about and focusing on. I think when we spend our time on things that divide us, that focus on the advantages or the vote base or whatever of one group of people, we are spending our energy and using our political capital for the wrong things. We're spending our time on things that divide us instead of on things that unify us. We're spending our time on things that pull us back instead of things that take us forward. And I mean, we have too far to go and too much to do to waste that kind of effort.
I hope we see a change in the next few years. God knows we need it considering the economic conditions we live in. And I agree so wholeheartedly with you about the primary school approach. I think our kids come out completely not ready for anything by the time they're done with 12 years of schooling life. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
We have to enable them.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for your time, Naushad. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And congratulations on this again.
Get a sneak peek of exclusive content before everyone else, for channel members only. Memberships start at rupees 89. Hit the join button below.